theoretical and conceptual frameworks. We are starting to build an understanding, I'm sure, as you start to look through your articles. But I pulled a quote from a research article, or an article that's about how to do conceptual frameworks, in order to just frame our conversation. And that is, it says that it's the system of concepts, assumptions, expectations, beliefs, and theories that supports and informs your research. And thus, these things are a part of a key part of your design of your research. And others have noted that your conceptual or your theoretical framework is like the frame of a house. All right. And I'm going to talk in a moment in the next slide about the difference between conceptual and theoretical frameworks. But essentially, in either case, it's something that you hang your research on. So your confusion about conceptual versus theoretical frameworks is not a strange thing to be confused about. It is, in fact, a source of great confusion in the literature itself, and these two ideas are often used interchangeably. So my advice to you is to not actually worry that much about the difference. Many of the people I went to PhD school with came out of it without knowing the difference between conceptual and theoretical frameworks, all right? But in the interest of exploring it a little bit, here's 3 points that the difference might be related to. Number one, whether you take the ideas holistically from the literature or you create the concepts yourself out of the literature. So if you take it holistically, like I'm taking the idea of social capital and I'm going to write it up like Bourdieu talked about it. And that's this theory that underpins my research. Or you build it from the literature where you say, well, this person talked about this, that person talked about this other person talked about this other thing, and I'm going to essentially draw out these 3 things, and you make your 3 bullet points. Okay, so those might be some differences. Another way it's conceptualized as different is broad versus more specific. So broad, again, using the example of social capital is a very it's not super closely connected to what we see when we walk through a school, for example, right? I mean, social capital is at work. That's why it's a good theory for explaining things. But we don't hear a conversation and immediately think social capital. Well, I don't know. I don't usually do that, although maybe you do. Maybe you have this great connection to theory. Whereas if we walked through a hallway in a school and we heard a conversation, we might have a much more directly applicable specific conceptual framework in mind, such as a teacher-student-teacher dyadic response process. Okay, so that's something that's been conceptualized in the literature, that a typical classroom response process goes, the teacher says something, the student responds, the teacher says something back. It's called teacher-student-teacher dialogic or something like that. So that would be more of a conceptual framework. Why that happens would be more the theoretical framework. Okay, so conceptual framework, at least again, according to some people, is a little bit closer to the data. Finally, some people call a theoretical framework that it serves the role of a frame of reference. So it essentially becomes your assumptions or the assumptions that underlie your study versus something that you're testing, that is predictive. Okay, so those are 3 different ways that theoretical versus conceptual is described. In some ways, I'm laying this stuff out for the sake of curiosity and in developing an understanding, but I definitely don't expect this to be totally clear. It's not totally clear in the literature. It's not totally clear to most people who write and publish in educational research. And so it's okay to just maintain a general idea that conceptual and theoretical frameworks are somewhat interchangeable. Okay, so we will now go and explore more conceptual and theoretical frameworks. So in this next segment, we will go through 2 different articles that present different theoretical and conceptual frameworks to understand a particular problem. All right, so the problem is related closely to my dissertation research, which has to do with how does accountability affect instructional practice. And there are two different theories presented in these articles. And so thinking about like a theory as a frame of reference or something that supports your analysis, in one of the articles, in the first article we'll look through, the theory is around institutional processes, and then the second article, it's essentialism versus progressivism. I just want to let you know as well that in the second article, I'm going to be showing you an example of methods, just as a way of, again, trying to elucidate the idea of methods and get us closer to that point. So the first article is by Diamond and Spallon, and it's about high-stakes accountability and how it might challenge or reproduce inequality. So that's the problem that they're laying out. The only one thing I want to point out on this page is that they call their theoretical framework theoretical tools, which is a little bit annoying since all we talk about is theoretical frameworks, but generally speaking, most articles call it either a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework. And then just to see the start of this sentence, some explanations for this pattern focus on the direct effects of, and we'll go to the next page. Okay, so moving along, the direct effects of family backgrounds, such as class-based disparities. So they're laying out, hey, you know, some people use as an explanatory theory for tests and how they turn out family background, beliefs, involvement, family structure, etc. All right. And then they say other scholars focus on the interaction between these characteristics and school practices. So they're saying, hey, look, there's these two ways to think about accountability and student performance and how this affects things. All right. Then here's them saying, look, this is our approach. This is our theoretical, like our framework of our house, right? Like we were saying, is institutional stratification, which highlights the implications of interorganizational processes of social stratification. So I know you've read a little bit about social stratification. And they're going to lay this theory out now, and they say, well, race and social class shape school attendance, and then this then of course affects test scores and so on and so forth. All right, so they're laying this out as kind of a theoretical understanding and assumption that underlies their research. So again, here's where this is an interesting model. They take that broad theory about stratification, educational stratification based on social stratification, which they just laid out, and they say that they're arguing that the implications of policies like high-stakes accountability are shaped by this stratification process. And then they make their argument that these are several types of schools, elite and public and private and this and that the patterns that happen in these schools create certain concentrations. Okay, so so they are taking a kind of a high-level theory that's a little bit disconnected, you know, it's a little bit unclear how it relates to reality, and they're defining how it relates to educational reality right here. And then they go straight into their context. So in the end of this article, they then come back around, they demonstrate how accountability pressure that results from these essentially stratification processes then changes the way that students are taught within the schools. And so in some ways brings the argument back around to how stratification, social stratification shapes institutional stratification, and then that in the end results in different ways of teaching. So here is someone investigating a very similar problem, which has to do with the way teachers teach in high-stakes accountability context, but taking a different lens to it. And this is Watanabe. It's a very excellent example of ethnography. And please keep in mind for these papers that the point is not necessarily for you to read them either during this lecture or later, although you are certainly welcome to, but I'm just going to be pointing out particular features. However, you may download these. They will be linked in the week 8 page. So she takes a departure, or she uses this term, theoretical framework, like a more common term. And again, she's making an argument. She says that this departs from a typical policy footprint approach, right? Which is the idea of examining the impact of the policy on teachers and the students in the classroom. And she says instead that the assumptions underlying this study is that of an embedded context perspective with a focus on classroom practice and context. So this is very much, if you get back to the educational reform class, and we talked a lot about assumptions, this would be her acknowledging that this is an assumption that guides her research, that context, starting with context, is an important place to start to understand teacher practice. So then she spends the rest of the theoretical framework laying out the difference between progressivism and constructivism and essentialism, right? And so she lays out a brief history of what it means to be a progressive or constructionist teacher versus an essentialist teacher. So learning math and science inductively, you can see down here, at the bottom, by designing and analyzing their own scientific studies and so forth and so on. So she lays out this juxtaposition between the two. So the essentialist perspective, Watanabe argues, approaches teaching and learning quite differently, with the idea that there's a core body of knowledge and it essentially needs to be dumped into students' heads. And then she cites one of the major proponents of essentialism. So she's kind of laying out this juxtaposition right here. So after laying out these two ideas that might guide the way we think about teaching and learning, this is where she really builds the framework of the house of her research. She says, look, these two ideas about teaching and learning have collided in the context of accountability because the teachers believed in a progressive and constructivist vision, but the policymakers believed in an essentialist idea of teaching and learning. And so it creates a particular lack of alignment. And essentially she's saying, in this study, she's going to explore what happens when those two things are not aligned. And to read here for a moment, pits constructivist visions of teaching against the standardized practices of the high-stakes statewide accountability program. And the article is very good, I will have you know. So before leaving this article, I want to take a moment to explore how she writes her methods, because I think this is a very good example. And in the classes I teach here, I don't always use examples from articles because they may seem a bit intimidating. I mean, this person has been writing academic articles for some period of time, and I don't want it to seem intimidating. But you all have perhaps rightfully asked for the very, very best models. And the very, very best models, we really need to turn to the literature for those models. So I'm going to talk through a little bit about what makes this a really good model for methods. So up above here, she has talked about, starting in the page before, she's talked about why she's doing a case study. So she specifically outlines that she is doing a case study. She's got her citations here, you can see this. And then she describes the particular type of sampling, that it's going to be theoretical sampling, and she describes what it is with citations, all right? Then she says, okay, here's exactly how I did the sampling, all right? First of all, she looked at subject areas to think about what she wanted to do and decided she would research a tested subject, which makes sense given the focus of her work, right? Then she justifies using 7th grade teachers here, right? So this is a theoretical sampling procedure. There's a reason for every step, all right? And she justifies why that might be the case. Then she goes into why she sampled a particular school, okay? And she talks about, again, she justifies each of the things, each of the reasons why. Finally, she goes into the justification for the selection of focal teachers. The criterion, it's a nice word, main criterion, I use to select them. And then she actually has the criterion, the years of experience, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see some very nice citations here. So then you can see here a nice table. This has to do with schools that she selected for another component of her study, a comparative component. So just again, you know, a table is a great way to display the data of the context that you selected. Moving into data collection, you can see a very good example of the specificity with which she wrote up her data collection. And this, by the way, is also a good example of how you're going to rewrite your methods in past tense. Now, please do not panic. I know she spent a ridiculous amount of time and effort on this process, and she wrote a very exceptional PhD out of this. This is not expected of you for your dissertation. What I want you to focus on instead is the specificity, right? And also how she uses numbers and bullet points here, right? You don't need to necessarily write this up in paragraphs. So she's got her classroom observations, very clear. Interviews, very clear. Interviews with teachers at other schools, very clear. The time period, how many interviews, right? During, you know, how many hours of observation, these kinds of things. And now watch this. This is the trustworthiness. She doesn't call it that, but she says, these sources allow me to triangulate my data to warrant my assertions. And then she says, in addition, documents and so on and so forth. And now here you can see that she has a data analysis section. So I just want to point it out because we're not getting into this until next quarter, but in case you want an example of what it looks like to write up your data analysis, it's right here. The next two sections essentially correspond to the idea of trustworthiness, except she talks about the strengths and the limitations. So she talks about the importance of the methodological choices she makes. How do they lead to her understanding particular things in her classroom? Consistent patterns of findings is what she's looking for across classrooms. However, she says there's a limitation, right? This isn't quantitative research that's causal. So this is also a very lovely element of qualitative trustworthiness. She calls it evidentiary warrant. She says, I made an effort to meet the criteria Erickson, a major qualitative research methodologist, described as necessary for qualitative studies to have this evidentiary warrant, which is essentially trustworthiness, which is an adequate amount of evidence, an adequate variety of kinds of evidence, and an adequate quality and depth. Oh, and then finally, a rigorous search for disconfirming evidence. Okay, that is such an excellent list right there. And if you want to look up Erickson and see it and think about that for your own work, that might be a really great thing to do. Not for your pilot study. This is really just something to think about for your dissertation. But this is essentially what a really good trustworthiness section looks like. You reach out to the methodological literature, you talk about what's required for your data and your evidence to be trustworthy, and then you talk about how your research does that.